Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We really appreciate all the time and effort you've made to be here. I wanted to start off by asking our new board chair, Dr. Mbasiani, to say a few words, introduce himself, and here.
Oh, I should have brought my computer.
It's okay. It's okay. So, Ito.
Oh, I'm up, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good morning. Good afternoon. She got me unawares. I think many of the board members, I think, know me, but I'll just say hello anyway. So I'm now 6 weeks on the job as the chair of the ICOC, nominated by the governor and lieutenant governor. And I sometimes ask, why did they do that to me? And I think it's because of my experience. I've got 4 chapters to my life. I've been in academics, although my PhD is in the humanities. I spent 27 years in the Army Medical Corps with 4 deployments to combat zones, and 10 years as the state surgeon of the California National Guard, almost 30 years as a clinical surgeon of urology in the Kaiser Permanente system in Los Angeles, still clinically active, and dedicating myself voluntarily 1 weekend a month at Kern Medical Center, Bakersfield County Hospital, to keep my surgical skills up. And 8 years serving in the cabinet of 2 governors, Governor Brown and Governor Newsom. And I think probably the reason they nominated me is because of that experience with legislative, governmental, regulatory, and financial aspects of government, including personal contacts with all of our legislators in Sacramento and in Washington, and with great familiarity with the bond process. I'm delighted to be here as the chair of the board and to have my new vice chair here and our wonderful president. I think we've got a tremendous working team here to lead us into our 3rd decade, with your help also, board members and guests. Thank you.
Thank you. Marianne, can you call the roll?
Will do. Dan Burnell. I thought I saw you, Dan. Join us.
You didn't say Lisa, but she hated. She picked that up.
Dan, are you there? Maria Bonner.
Present.
Ann Boynton. James DeBenedetti.
Here.
Dana Dornside.
Here.
Dana Goldman. Ted Goldstein. David Higgins.
Here.
Vito Mbasiani.
Here.
Harlan Levine.
Here.
Pat Levitt.
Here.
Adriana Padilla. Amar Padan.
Here.
Al Roulette. David Serrano Sewell. Okay. Meswari Senthil. Adrian Shapiro.
Here.
And then Dan Burnell checking on again.
Present.
Okay, got it. I think I just saw Adriana Padilla.
Yeah, here.
And then Maheswari Senthil.
Yeah, here.
Okay, we're good. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Today is, Sean will be presenting the final subject matter before the roadmap comes to us next month. As you know, over the course of the last year, he and his team have come to us, to the working group, to outline different areas and tactics that we might use to help patients in California access our trials and afford them. And there are different measures to that. And you're going to walk us through some of those things today. And then next month, we'll have a bigger picture of what the next few years holds for this working group, as well as for CIRM in these areas. So Sean, take it away.
All right. Well, thank you, Vice Chairman and Chairman. Welcome. AAWG members, thank you for the opportunity to present today. I want to first make sure everybody can see my slides. Flopping around a little bit. Just
Yes.
give me a thumbs up.
Yep.
Wonderful. All right, well, we have a very interesting discussion today, and as our Vice Chairman mentioned, this is the last of our due diligence on a number of investigations, if you will, that we've researched with respect to access and affordability. So I'm going to start with this slide, and this is our roadmap to access and affordability strategies. We continue to work from this AAWG approved strategy to frame our discussion around access and affordability for cell and gene therapy. And as a reminder, and sort of to piggyback what our Vice Chairman just mentioned, the roadmap is part of our 5-year strategic plan for gathering the necessary data and information to support reimbursement for products resulting from CIRM's programs, including developing novel healthcare and coverage models, which is the topic of today's discussion. So just for background, the way we approached our methodology is these, of course, are the 4 strategies that we all align to with respect to research. And we tried to marry 2 approaches here. One is, what is the journey, the patient journey for the patient that's going all the way from clinical trials, and we talked about patient support and out-of-pocket expenses going through that trial, and all the way to potential commercialization, and what does it look like for a patient to actually go into the commercial therapy. And then the other thing we tried to marry that with is, what does it look like for many of the cell and gene therapies through that clinical development program all the way to post-marketing, which we talked about in a couple of other sessions ago. So the marry of those 2 really give us in areas where there's pressure points and areas that are difficult for patients that we think we can identify, and we have, for funding mechanisms for the 5-year strategic plan. So today, specifically, I do want to focus on coverage analysis, which is, to be honest with you, hot off the press. And then I want to focus on a little bit on performance-based models, which I presented some time ago. These are these outcomes-based models that are very popular now with cell and gene therapies. And we received some new information that was published last month that will give us some intel on how prevalent they are and where there's an opportunity for us to consider some funding mechanisms. So let me first start with this slide. And we're lucky enough now that we have some extra horsepower, if you will, from a research standpoint. And we've consulted with a group that could provide deep research on payer coverages. And through this process, we've identified a potential problem. And that's not the best way to start this talk, but it is something that we see as something that could impact patients with respect to access and affordability. And the problem statement is a lack of transparency of payers' coverage policies for cell and gene therapies. So let me walk you through this and where we think there's a potential recommendation on 2 fronts. So we do know historically that coverage policies are limited, whether it's small molecule, large molecule, regardless of cell and gene therapies. But we also have noticed now recently that there's been a number of policies that have restricted coverage with respect to cell and gene therapies. And as we all know, again, many cell and gene therapies are going to reach the market within the next 1 to 3 years, many with high price points. Now, to be fair, those price points have been validated with respect to pharmacoeconomics. So from a cost effectiveness standpoint, they are well received by payers. But on the other hand, payers are designing narrow coverage policies for cell and gene therapy to reduce their financial risk. And that's not surprising. And the reason why it's not surprising is, one, there's an upfront cost to many of these therapies. And many insurers, particularly those in the middle, are having a very difficult time thinking about how are we going to afford that upfront cost right out of the gate. We understand from a cost effectiveness standpoint down the road that's going to pay dividends, particularly when you're talking about curing a patient. But at the same time, payers are thinking about, well, how can we restrict some of these cell and gene therapies specifically to the label? And that's important. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So what we were able to identify, at least from what's been published recently, is a number of examples of restrictive coverage policies for cell and gene therapy. And everything that's up here is linked to the peer-reviewed publications. So moving forward, everything in medical affairs that's presented from the AAWG, we will have the citations. All the citations are online. So if you want to take a look at any of this information, it's all referenced in the slide deck. Now, I won't go through each and every one of these, but it does set precedents that payers do restrict the label. And it's not so much with respect to dosing or schedule. It's really about medical necessity, whether or not the patient actually meets the need, the absolute requirement for the gene therapy. And so that's where it gets a little bit slippery. And that's where there's an opportunity for us to expand on the research. So just real quickly, let me run through these. So Zolgensma was restricted a little bit with respect to age. And many of you know that was one of the first gene therapies for spinal muscular atrophy. Hemgenix just recently for hemophilia B has been restricted to some extent. Blue Cross Blue Shield for Luxturna, which we talked about actually in another meeting yesterday with medical affairs for the associated retinal dystrophy. And then finally, and I'm sure Dr. Harlan could opine here, there's been quite a bit of restrictions on the policy side with respect to the immunotherapies on the oncology side, as well as the autoimmune side. So the question is, what can we do about it? And I'm going to give an example of what's done in industry. So when we prepare for a drug launch, we know that there's going to be pushback by the payers. And we do a due diligence on which payers are likely going to align with the FDA label and who is going to push back a little bit based on they want additional information, efficacy, safety data. Now, let me back up even a little further. Just because you have FDA authorization, marketing authorization, doesn't mandate payer reimbursement. It's a whole nother animal. And so this is where market access and traditional medical affairs starts to tee up what type of data, additional data, are we going to need to address payers' concerns. So payers can come back and say, well, I'd like to see more information on children less than 2 years of age. What do you have? And this is where the manufacturer, potentially the hospital, will say, well, this is what we have on file. Here's everything that we did in our clinical trial. But more importantly, what we can do and what has been done is designing new trials to address unanswered questions from payers. And what's been done currently is the real world data. So this fits into how important the real world data is to responding to payers' questions and denials to some extent about additional data. And I'll continue to emphasize how important real world data is through this presentation, but it is now precedent that real world data has been used not only from a regulatory filing for continued supplements of NDA or a BLA, but more importantly, it has been used from denials by payers in the cell and gene therapy space for additional efficacy and safety data to support the therapy. So one of the things that we were thinking is this is just a snapshot of what's out there. We have not done a full review of the coverage analysis on payers for cell and gene therapy. But one recommendation is that we like to convene a much larger, robust coverage analysis for payer policies for cell and gene therapy to review and advise on opportunities CIRM can deploy to help California patients. The other thing that I'd like to stress test with the AAWG really is around denial, if you will. When a payer, when we talk about benefit managers, so earlier in these presentations, we talked about the difference between patient navigators that are helping patients through the clinical trial process and the patient support program and how they may be positioned in the community care centers of excellence. The other thing that takes place is the appeal process. So if anybody here at this table, certainly the clinicians on the call, the patient advocacies have probably experienced what it's like to have a denial from a payer. Did not meet their specific requirements for a particular therapy. And the process of going through the appeal process can be incredibly burdensome, not only for the clinic, and I know many alpha clinics certainly have the expertise to do this, but when you start thinking about the appeal process for patients, the appeal process for the family members, the appeal process for community docs who are out there who really are, have a limited staff to be able to handle that, that's where things really slow down. And so that's another question I have for the AAWG, and whether or not that's something that we could consider out in the community care centers of excellence. So again, we have those patient navigators that are helping patients with the clinical trials, but should we consider down this road with respect to the roadmap, benefit managers who have the expertise to be able to get patients approval through insurance in a timely manner. And I could see this being a potential positive, certainly for patients out there in the rural communities who just don't have that type of support. So with that, I'd like to pause a little bit here. I knew I threw a lot at you, but I would like to get the input of the AAWG and even my colleagues here around the table of whether or not we're tracking in the right direction here with respect to looking at coverage analysis for payers, particularly in cell and gene. There's some opinion that this is a pattern that they can expect moving forward, particularly with hemophilia B, which many studies are now looking at specific mutations. And there's a much larger population that doesn't have that particular mutation, and whether or not payers are actually going to cover those patients. Sickle cell is another example where there's specific mutations that are in the original trial. Additional mutations were not. And then the question is that generalizable to the rest of the sickle cell community? And so industry and patient advocacy and hospitals are starting to think through what type of data generation do we need to create in order to get ready for that sort of pushback. So let me pause there if it's okay with the AAWG. And excuse me.
There's a hand raised.
Oh, there is. Yes, let me, and I don't see the hand, so I'll have to ask Mary.
Yeah.
But first, let me get some feedback if we can and make sure that we're tracking in the right direction here.
Amar Padan has his hand raised.
Yes, thank you. I am also want to welcome the new chair. So welcome to the board. Sean, this is really, good work to start thinking about it. One of the things I remember a few months ago when ABLA shared with us the clinical program, which I believe, I don't know for others, I believe we need to have another round of discussions around the clinical program because that fast run is not enough for us to digest the work that is going on, the different indications that we're seeking, all of those types of things. So there might be a need for another round so that we can give also better feedback. So that's one thing. The second thing, when we had that discussion, I think Abla mentioned that we have, we're gathering, in fact, some economic data, healthcare utilization in our clinical development program. I remember I was assured that we're recruiting a third party to do that. So I don't know what type of data is being gathered, if any. And so maybe that's, if it's not done, then we need to do it. And the third thing is, going back to my recommendation during the last meeting, we need to have a full-time health economist on board to start looking at how we want to gather the data and how we want to use the data. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Any other comments?
Maria, Worry about it.
Just really quickly, when you talk about your convened coverage analysis, can you expand on what you mean? Do you mean you're going to call individual? Are you talking about bringing people together? Are you talking about hiring a consultant to get this? Are we talking about convening a summit here? Like, what do you mean by convened coverage analysis?
Yeah, I was really impressed with what the team found in the last couple of weeks, and they do have to do some digging. My recommendation is to continue what we're doing now. Let the team dig a little bit deeper into what's been published and what hasn't with respect to payer policies.
Which our team internally?
It could be our team as well as the consulting team that has
Got it.
actually done a
That's
lot of the
okay.
research.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah, really impressed with the team. And just for background, this is the analysis group that's here located in California that does a lot of HEOR work and was able to find some really interesting information.
Yeah, I don't have a computer to raise a hand, so I'm just going to raise my hand. Just following up on Maria's question, I'm sure we're going to be impressed with our internal. I'd like to be impressed with the coverage people. Are they going to be forthcoming, do you think?
So if you mean getting payers in the room,
Yes.
that's a different deliverable. So yes, so just for feedback, I think what we were talking about there is getting payers into the room and
Yes.
start asking them about what their concerns are with respect to cell and gene therapy.
Yeah, or do they have a model that they might want to propose?
Yeah, and I know Dr. Levine and I talked about this, and that's a good question. That's a really good question. I hope they are. I hope they are absolutely candid, so they tell us, here's the concerns, and you know, talking to payers myself, what the concerns are, I think would resonate with them, and that is that upfront cost. I think the other concern is, the follow-up to some extent. What does that look like? And these contracts, which I'll get into as the next topic, is fascinating what we just found in the last 2 weeks. So I hope the answer is yes. I think with the AAWG's recommendations of who we can get in the room, whether it's the Blue Cross, Kaisers of the world, as long as it's a safe harbor for them to be able to have that discussion with us, I think we can get some good information.
I had a second question, unrelated. I'm just looking at the bold examples of restrictive coverage policies, right? My personal knowledge, experience, the last 20 years of healthcare coverage in California, groups offered what they offered until the legislator said, not enough, not good enough. So 20 years ago, all healthcare providers in California had to offer OBGYN care, prenatal care, perinatal care, whatever, okay? And then about 15 years ago, the mental health community they got a bill through the legislature in California requiring parity, meaning if you took care of the physical needs, you were equally obligated to. So do you see a legislative boost for this? And this is probably premature, the question, but maybe not so much.
Well, you're thinking through that roadmap and what this 5-year strategy. So I like that. The answer is yes. We are talking about cell and gene therapies here, right? So it is a little bit niche-y, if you will.
Yeah.
But when you talk about, oncology, which is a big budget impact factor for payers, certainly. And we have just sort of dabbled in the policy side in terms of what we could support, what we could consider putting together ourselves with respect to the proposition. But certainly all for it if we can, be able to, I wouldn't say drive our own policy, but certainly support policy that's out there that would impact access and affordability for patients, particularly the underserved and more importantly, the rural communities. There is a race right now to the rural community, whether it's us or industry or, other organizations. So that's a good thing to see. But we really need to do a deep dive on our opportunities on policy. Yeah, absolutely.
And we have David Higgins and then Harlan Levine next. You're on mute, David.
Thank you. I have a fundamental question about what our goals are. Sort of are we going deep or are we going wide? And the question simply is, would we try to get the pharmaceutical industry to cover more indications or cover indications with more money? So are the benefits to the patients, do they come with funding a broader range of indications or more money for any given indication? I hope that's clear.
Yeah, so let me answer. I think the strategy that I like to propose is more about data generation that we can develop or at least fund that would help with the payers' questions with respect to efficacy, additional efficacy and safety data. So we wouldn't work directly with the pharmaceutical companies or biotech unless they engaged with us and thought that they're a good and mutual understanding in terms of what the specific aim was, and that was setting up an infrastructure, whether it's a community care centers of excellence, that real-world data generation, so that we can prepare for our investments, quite frankly, what are going to be sort of the stopgaps, if you will, from payers, and can we think about what those challenges are now, start collecting that data, setting up the trials, and prepare for immediately to respond to any of those payers that have questions, additional questions about efficacy and safety. And so that does in itself expand access to patients. I wouldn't get, another level of this, and we're getting into layers, is to think about, well, is the data valid enough where we could go back or help one of our funders, if you will, go back to the FDA with additional real-world data to change or modify or update the supplemental BLA.
Arlen, Levine?
Yeah, a couple thoughts on this, and I think some of it gets into the granularity of how these things get executed. So, one comment I would make is, unlike oncology, where you kind of get cancer and you need to get treatment relatively quickly, a lot of these conditions are chronic conditions, and if you have one health plan with a more generous policy than another one, you're going to get people switching at the end of the year, and then you're going to have this race to the bottom where no one wants to have benefits for this. So I think you can make a health policy argument that there really needs to be parity for these conditions across the health plans. Not just because it's easier for the provider, but otherwise you got to get anyone that provides reasonable benefits is going to get disproportionately affected as people move from one plan to another. So I think we have to be really, I think legislative approach is going to be important here. I think consistency is important here. And I think you can ask yourself, why would there be different coverage between different benefits, between different payers? So that's just one comment. The second comment I would make is think about, the way oncology is paid today is particularly for outpatient hospital units and doctor offices, they purchase the drug and then they infuse the drug and they charge a margin. And usually the margin is a percentage of the cost of the drug, which, by the way, never really made all that much sense, but that's the way it's been done. There's a trend now with Kymriah and the other CAR-Ts to not want to pay a margin because these are $400,000 drugs and they don't want to pay the 20%, 10%, 6%, whatever it is. And what's happened now is that the payers are arguing to pay zero on top of the drug cost, which is a disincentive for the providers to actually bother to give the drug because they're taking up a bed or a chair where they could be making margin as opposed to breaking even. So this isn't said to benefit payers, but I think it's to create a market to benefit providers. But if you don't allow for some sort of margin for the provider because these drugs are, quote, so expensive, you're not going to have any provider wanting to give any of these drugs. So I think we want to protect against eliminating the market. Number two, and then the last thing I would just comment on, you talked about the value over a lifetime. Well, so first of all, payers don't worry about lifetime value unless you're Medicare. But secondly, I think the bigger challenge is going to be payers left to their own devices will have different defined value propositions for things that work for 9 months or 12 months and then need repeat treatment. And some will say, well, the cost benefit analysis isn't worth it, so we're not going to cover it. And others will cover it. So and yet another reason why I think we just need to have try to take a strong stand and try to get consistent policies across payers, at least in California.
Very good. Thank you.
James has his hand raised.
Hey, thanks. So one thing I think you should do, and maybe you've done this already in your review of the laws, but talk to the regulators, say Department of Managed Healthcare, and maybe also Department of Insurance to see what the expectations are in terms of plans, what they're required to cover. So you can see what the floor is and see what carriers, if any, are above that floor, and maybe some aren't even meeting that floor and the regulators aren't aware of that. And then you also have the issue of ERISA plans, so self-funded offerings or plan offerings. The employers often don't have the same regulations overseeing them. They're exempt from a lot of them. So I don't know to the extent that might have an impact on what has to be covered or not. Something your regulator should be able to tell you about, though.
Yeah, thank you, James. That's good. Good, because that tees up the next question, slide. So, payer models. We were able to do a deep dive on payer models as much as we could. Now, these are proprietary, of course, with insurance companies and manufacturers. But what we've identified is a lack of standards for performance-based payment models. And I presented on this a couple times in the past, and I won't get into great granularity, but there's 4 of them that are prevalent out there: the annuity-based programs, outcomes-based programs, a hybrid thereof, and value-based warranties, which just in a press release for a biotech company here in the Bay Area is using for their hemophilia. So these are absolutely critical, again, when it comes to real-world data generation. And that's probably the last I'll say about real-world data, other than the fact that I think it's probably going to be in our year 1 strategy with respect to the roadmap. It is just that critical moving forward to make sure we have the infrastructure, the methodology. And it's not so much about collecting data. It's about collecting good data that will meet the payers' requirements, as well as potentially the competent authorities' requirements when it comes to real world. But another topic for another time. I do want to report on a survey that was just recently published or presented at the Academy of Managed Care Pharmacy. And so the AMCP is sort of the think tank when it comes to setting guidelines for dossiers that go to payers, public payers, CMS, et cetera. So they are the heavy hitters. They set the guidelines in terms of what has to be in that dossier for payers. Payers accept that, and then that's how the discussion proceeds. So this survey was fascinating. So it was designed to understand the U.S. payer perspective and experiences with innovative cell and gene therapy contracts. And the survey was sent to 30 different health plans. They were private. There were a couple, I think, public health plans as well. And what they found was the payment models are much more prevalent than previously recognized and well accepted by payers. The outcomes-based payments, which I talked about a couple weeks ago, were the most common. And they found that clinical trial data with real-world evidence were considered valuable endpoints for monitoring progress and measuring the success of innovative contracts. So again, this aligns with our sort of thinking and strategy, and aligns, of course, with the FDA's guidance on the value of real-world data. So based on the survey, they thought that in the next 3 to 5 years, respondents indicated that oncology, neurology, and immunology as the top 3 disease states of interest for innovative contracts, which of course were in all 3 of those disease spaces. The authors concluded that as more novel cell and gene therapies enter the market, innovative contracts will play a crucial role in reducing costs and improving access. And so one of the recommendations that we have to the AAWG, to the team here, is that we would like to extend our research standards with respect to innovative performance-based models. So we would like to take the lead in identifying what those standards should be. And not only for the state, and we could work with the alpha clinics in doing this, but there's also has been a call from CMS to do the same thing with states. States come to us, tell us what are the 3 best models that we should consider from a outcomes-based performance model, and we will consider them putting into CMS. And so there's sort of 2 plays here. One, let's strike up maybe a strike team, if you will, that would internally be able to give us guidance on what should be in those payer models. And then more importantly, guidance from the team in terms of how we can engage the alpha clinics and other subject matter experts that would be able to help us get to that finish line. So let me open it up to that for some additional questions. Does that make sense? Anything I need to clarify or perhaps go over a little bit more detail?
You just repeat the ask that you're asking us to respond to or opine on.
Yeah, I want to make sure we're tracking correctly here. And one is we plan to do additional research on identifying the standards for innovative performance-based payment models to collect relevant and appropriate outcomes data, addressing operational challenges in data collection while maximizing patient access and affordability. So really between this team, does that resonate with folks? Does that seem like that would be a part of the roadmap that we would consider for access and affordability? And do you see that as being a win-win on many levels?
Amar has his hand raised. Go ahead, Amar.
I think it's the right way to go, Sean. However, I would suggest that not losing time and resources on getting general recommendations and focus on our clinical program and what it is supposed to deliver, and then use that to do the research in more details. Because we're running the risk of getting some generalities out of that type of research that might not be that helpful or minimally helpful. Thank you.
Sean, I also have a question.
Mhm.
When you talk about the researching the standards, who do you go to for that? So like where do you get that information? Who are the players involved?
Yeah, so this stuff is highly proprietary.
Sure.
Right? Payers don't give up this information, and certainly consulting firms don't, but they will give you guidance in terms of what they're seeing out there. And the team that we're working with actually does create value-based contracts for the industry. And so they can give us guidance in terms of, what direction we need to go in and what type of data we should consider collecting.
Yes, Maria. Maria, do you have a question?
Thank you. So I wanted to, it's Maria Milan. I can't see many of you because I'm in the room, but a couple of comments. Amar brought up the healthcare economics research earlier, and then this topic. And, some opportunities that the AAWG can recommend are creating funding programs that marry these types of research and, fit for purpose type of analysis that have certain standards to them with our programs. There's also the opportunity to fund entities that could do this on our behalf for our program. So I just wanted to point out, kind of our business model as a funding agency and how we can move some of these opportunities forward. Regarding HEOR data that's been generated in the past, Abla may have mentioned that some of our programs did do some of this analysis, but they were essentially customized for the given trial, different platforms, et cetera. But we did consider it important, so they were allowable within our clinical programs. One could envision that it's not only something that's allowed, but it could be an expectation that we would have for our clinical programs to have the best type of evidence generation, not just from the scientific and clinical evidence generation, but in terms of HEOR and even real world evidence and data that is important for this program, not only for regulatory approval, but for coverage decisions later. And I'm not as familiar as many of you probably are, but I heard a really great talk well circulated. Mark McClellan gave an update on the CMS, the new CMS rules and the Price Reduction Act, and what the potential implications are. But certainly one of the aspects in terms of CMS is their use of real world evidence in informing their decisions. So it's extremely relevant. We don't know what the impact's going to be of some of these, of this current policy. There is a sense that actually it will actually benefit these rare high cost indications in some way, and kind of equalizing. I don't know if any members of the AAWG have any thoughts or about that, but in any case, I think the important thing is the type of evidence that is going to be considered important is something that's being brought up by Sean today. Thank you so much.
James has his hand raised.
So I'd say this approach makes a lot of sense to a lot of people, and I've heard a lot of talking about it years in the past, but I don't know how many organizations have actually implemented it. So I wouldn't build your whole program around it until you did some more research. Don't rely on it being the solution to your problems, because it is a lengthy, years if not decades long approach, and not everyone wants to kind of build their payments around something like that. It can get kind of complicated as well. So might be more in the domain of states rather than, say, employers or carriers or things like that. So just keep that in mind. Don't put too much expectation on this, even though it sounds like it makes sense.
Okay, good. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I just wanted, sorry, James, thank you so much. It's Maria Milan. Can you clarify, don't put too much emphasis on the approach of evaluating innovative payment models, or what did you mean?
Yeah, so
okay.
I think it's worth exploring, but I wouldn't build your program with the assumption that that is what will solve your problems, because you may not be able to get things like this to be widespread like you might like them to. If it only works for 1 out of every 10 or 1 out of every 100 cases that you bring
Right.
up,
Right. Thank you.
Yeah.
Pat has his.
Thanks, James.
Yeah, Sean, are there discussions in terms of public payers and what they're, I mean, they can't be as covert in terms of information, right, about how they're thinking about structuring, payments. So, Medi-Cal, for example, where a third of the California population is covered, that deals with the accessibility issue as well. But is there information coming from, are they involved in planning how they're going to deal with what kind of model they're going to use?
It's a good question, and it is obviously in the public domain, and they've been very forthright in terms of, and I'm speaking from CMS at this point, they're very proactive in reaching out to states to get guidance on what they think should be the requirements for outcomes-based performance models. We haven't engaged with the state at this point, so I can't comment on what Medi-Cal is doing, but that's certainly on our radar, and maybe Senator Torres perhaps could start getting those interactions started.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, no, we haven't engaged with the state at this point, and I think there's a little bit of to be honest with you, many states are a little bit hesitant in terms of which direction they need to go in right now. I think it's coming from the top down rather than the bottom up. And as my comment earlier is really about, hey, let's take it from the bottom up and see if we can drive some of these activities with the state as well as all the way up to CMS.
I think something else to consider is what exactly our ask is of them. So we have to look at where our portfolio is. Is it across cell and gene therapy that we want the information? Is it something specific to one of our one of our programs. So I think we have to craft our own strategy internally for what we want from them in order to be able to drive the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, there's a European agency that does this across all of Europe for different countries in terms of defining exactly what they mean in terms of the types of therapy. So it may be worth looking at those. I'm not an expert in this area at all. I just read this stuff and see what they're trying to define as therapies that they would put under this rubric, and then figure out how they're going to use performance to determine accessibility. They have very different payer models, so that's not going to be relevant. But I'm also a little bit nervous about going to other states to get their information about what they're doing, because California has been pretty entrenched in their Medicaid reimbursement models for decades. So unless there's an epiphany and that changes, which I don't believe is going to happen, it may not be relevant to get information from New York or Illinois or wherever, right? Because it just doesn't apply here.
Okay, good.
Sean, can I make a comment?
Yeah, certainly.
So since you were last speaker, Pat, I wondered if you can, comment on what I'm about to say, which is that at one of the prior meetings, Sean had, and Abla Creasy had highlighted that currently half of our program is in rare disease. And we may be facing a different scenario for rare disease and in pediatrics than we do for the more common, broader indications, such as oncology, for instance. And so that's something for us to consider when we talk to those who are the first ones out there marketing gene therapies for rare disease, such as spinal muscular atrophy, et cetera. What we're finding is they're actually not, having as much of an issue getting private insurance coverage for these indications because of the nature. These are severely unmet medical needs, fatal disorders, pediatrics, and all that. So it's more of a statement more than anything. So even these value-based, I think that was a very important cautionary tale in terms of how much you put into take stock in terms of one size fits all approach to evaluating innovative models. So that is, doesn't mean that there can't be a uniform, more efficient way to gain coverage for a rare disease. It's definitely a need. But I wanted to point that out and just, I'd love to hear whether that is, from your perspective, that is a fair statement, or you have any other thoughts about that?
Yeah, I mean, what we're supporting now is really has a focus on rare diseases, but that's likely to change over time with advances in technology, right? So, diseases such as diabetes are not rare. And, cellular therapeutics in just a relatively short period of time has advanced pretty dramatically. And so, I don't know how to answer that. I mean, I think you're right in the moment that is correct, but and maybe this is focused on what we're dealing with in the moment. I'm just sort of thinking about how the trend has been occurring in terms of all healthcare coverage in the state of California for a third of the population, and the trends are not good, right? And so, contemplating how they're going to deal with these therapies, which are unbelievably unbelievable economic challenges. I think, I don't have the answer to it, but I think you're correct in terms of what you're describing in the here and now.
Right. So that's just, so if you're talking about a portfolio-based approach, I just wanted to point out that some of the portfolio-based approach in the moment may be relying on that kind of specialized boutique type of coverage. And then as we develop kind of the broader, so Sean had previously mentioned two types of, I would say demonstration cases or indications that allow us to cover both spans. One is the cancer indications, the CAR Ts that are more mature, and then the rare disease ones, and they may require a different type of consideration, and the board may say they're both important, or the board of the AWG's recommendation may say focus on X or Y, right? So that's just, I just pointed out as in terms of the type of direction that the internal team, would really find useful in terms of developing approaches to bring more information to you and to the board. Thank
Yeah.
you.
I mean,
Adriana?
I was going to say, let me follow up, but one of the things to consider is that, we have a communication strategy in which we're trying to emphasize the breadth and depth of the impact of CIRM broadly on the population. And so I think we have to be careful, in my mind, about communicating where the focus is for some of these, some of the disease targets, which, scientifically makes sense, but we don't want mixed messages, right? That in the here and now we're talking about rare diseases, and that payer involvement is going to be more straightforward than we think, and at the same
No,
time,
absolutely.
then at the same time talking about the impact on the population of California broadly. Those are mixed messages, right?
Yes, you're absolutely right. And the thing is that the initial indications for the rare disease it's really a springboard for the larger indications because it's a technology platform validation. And the idea is that would be broader. So you're absolutely right. The target is the broader. Thank you so much.
Right.
Great point.
Okay, thanks.
Adriana?
Yes, I was just going to comment that coverage has always been the bane of my existence in private practice, basically, and it's not just for cell and gene therapy, it's for anything that we use in medicine today. Coverage is horrible. What I do know, though, is that Medicare, usually Part D, does their own contracting models, and a lot of the commercial insurances kind of base their coverage to what Medicare does. And have you studied the Part D part of Medicare to see what kind of policies they've set forth for coverage of rare diseases in the over 65 population, to see what standards they use and whether that might be helpful in working with the commercial insurances?
Yeah, Adriana, that's a good point. Certainly familiar with Part D and in the oncology space, but for the rare disease space, that's something we'd have to investigate further. But that's a good point. Thank you.
Adrian? Adrian, are you on mute?
Adriana?
It's Adrian.
It won't. Hi, I'm sorry.
There
I
you
got
go.
a knot. Hi, a knot in the pit of my stomach because, when we're looking at coverage and seeing from our group, from the sickle cell perspective, that we are having real trouble accessing what we need, or comparing ourselves to other diseases in the chronic space, as chronically ill space, as well as the rare space. So I just want to put it out there that when you start talking about looking at other states and things, I would really like for us to look at what's happening in California, because I think we have an opportunity here to, because we have like everything that we need. We have our portfolio that's got, our rare diseases, but we have a large sickle cell population, which is rare to have in the rare space, to have such a large population, which will also give us some insight to what happens throughout the country on looking at things in terms of equity and bias. Also, we have quite a bit of documentation on what happens when a person, the public programs versus private, because we do have a portion of our population that actually is covered by private insurance. And the things that we see happening when we're up against trying to get treatment for our disease compared to what's happening with someone in terms of billing who has cancer. So I like the idea of us kind of doing a deep dive and looking at real world data, but it can get really knotty. There can be a lot of complications. So I would really like for us to just maybe kind of look at what we can look at in California and then go from there. Just kind of do our as our pilot, coming back to as our pilot, because we're about to, I mean, nobody expected to have a cure for sickle going as quickly as it has, and it's here. We all know that this is just the beginning, and this is a technology-based approach, a technology-based thing, and we know what happens when that happens. The people come out, the first out the gate, right? Just start at the standard and prove it can be done, and then everybody else starts where they are, right, and improves. And so it's going to go really, really fast. I just don't want us getting mired, and because I believe that I have seen the effect that the policies followed by CIRM have made in other states. The requirements they have for funding, how the quality of research in the last 7 years by being really involved, I have seen the impact. So I think we have the I'm going to say responsibility to do this in a way where we're covering things honestly and not like they've been done before. And I think this is the opportunity to really have that real life, real data and real data, not just, how can I put this? Meaning that we're really going to be touching and getting the data that's held back, right? And having the health economists help us understand, because there's a lot that goes on that has to be explained to laymen about that. But I feel like if we're just looking at California, I'm being redundant, I'm sorry. I would like to see us do that, because we have, in that sense, a controlled, known environment from which we can then make hypotheses and document and share that information.
And maybe let me clarify something. Thank you for that. That was incredibly helpful. When I spoke about other states, I didn't want to emphasize that we were going to go look at what other states are doing. I think my point was CMS is asking for other states, right, including us, guidance in terms of what those models look like. Yeah. So just a clarity, but thank you for that.
No. Yeah, I understood that. But just when we start doing that, looking backwards, not backwards, I shouldn't say it, I don't mean backwards, just because I just know how fast this is going to go. And I know that my community's losing people who could really benefit from this technology. And so we can answer these questions and get ahead of that curve I see of people becoming uneligible. That would be really great. So I guess that's what I'm saying. And we just like focus it, and then shorter iterations. Does that make sense, or am I?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay.
Absolutely. Maybe focus just on a specific therapeutic space and take this baby steps with respect to phase in terms of how we approach. And this is part of the roadmap, to be honest with you. So we will consider additional research. I mean, there's a lot of unanswered questions out there. And one of the challenging and unique things about cell and gene therapy is everything is moving simultaneously. The payer space, the therapies, how drugs are being manufactured and distributed. And we're trying to, I think everybody is trying to, compartmentalize each section to see where are there places that we might be able to have impact on patients with respect to access.
It's come up.
one thing I just want to circle back to is something Amar brought up at the beginning of the meeting was understanding where our portfolio is and using that as a basis of sort of where the direction we take, considering, you know, our work is in support of the work that CIRM does and funds. And so really being able to take a look at the portfolio, understand where we are in respect to the different clinical trials we're funding, and understanding what they need in order to have access and affordability for the patients in their trials, and then the patients in California, I think would be a really great place to start if we could get some momentum there.
I know Harlan wants to say something, but on that, so I wanted to just raise kind of the how-tos in doing that, right? Rather than continuing to have presentations by our team about the portfolio. How do you really look at the portfolio and help it direct? So for sickle cell, for instance, there are two gene therapies that are on the verge of, that are due to be approved this year. They're not CIRM programs, right? One is CRISPR and one is from Bluebird Bio. So the question is, if we're,
But we are funding sickle cell. We are funding a sickle cell trial.
When we're funding sickle cell, so I wanted to just
Yes.
make clear, it's not necessarily the portfolio, but it's the indications that are covered by our portfolio.
Exactly.
I wanted to make that distinction, that it's not a per project based, that it's a scope based type of analysis. So I just wanted to highlight that, because if we are very literal about it, we might, not be, doing what Adrian is asking, which is really looking at how these can benefit patients, not at their potential curative therapies that are now at this point potentially approved. So that's just, anyway, Harlan, I'm sorry to interrupt.
No, not at all. And at this point, it's a little off topic, but I just think we should also look back to when CAR T was first released, that CMS approved the treatment but did not approve payment. So private payers were paying for, CMS was not. I think there's still things where Medicaid's not paying for genomic things. And I think we ought to just kind of look at that and make sure we're not in a position, we don't find ourselves in a position again where there's a disconnect between what the government's paying for and the payers are paying for. And if so, we should bring it to light faster, so there's not that gap that we're hearing, we're concerned about, particularly in the Medi-Cal population.
Yeah, good point. Okay, well, lively discussion. So thank you for all the comments and feedback. It's very helpful. So at this point, that was the last of our presentations with respect to the due diligence on the research for the roadmap. And just as a quick refresher, we talked about patient support services, new payer models. At one point, we talked about inpatient to outpatient setting, particularly in the CAR T space. We did bring up a number of opportunities in state and federal policy. We obviously have a lot of opportunity with the Alpha Clinics and the Community Care Centers of Excellence as part of the roadmap, real world data, health econ, post-marketing requirements, and then of course today a little bit of coverage analysis and insurance restrictions that we're starting to see. So the next presentation, which will be in 4 weeks, will be our roadmap and recommendations. We're looking at a potentially 5-year plan. We may exceed it or extend it to 7 years, depending on what's available in terms of research for some of the late stage sort of investments or funding opportunities. So really look forward to presenting that to the AAWG in the next 4 weeks. And so Vice Chairman, hand it over to you and see if there's any additional questions or comments.
Are there any comments from the group? No hands raised that I see. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sean, for this presentation. It was great. Thanks to everyone, and we will see you in about a month. If you have any questions in the meantime, please do reach out to Sean or to myself. If you have questions about the direction this is taking, any input that you might want to give, it's really important to hear from you. So please feel free to call or email. Thank you.
Thank you.